Okay, welcome back, economists. We're here to think about our second type of a form of a market or a market structure, and that's monopolistic competition. And in that name, we can actually sort of pick out a lot of what we need to think about in terms of making sense of this market and how it functions. So we just finished the topic of perfect competition, which assumes that there are virtually an unlimited number of firms, and they all sell the same thing. Remember, that's mostly a theoretical type of market. It's really difficult to think about an example of a market that functions with all of those assumptions. But with this monopolistic competition idea, this is a much more realistic market structure. And in fact, I think most of the markets that we could think about operate within this sort of structure of a market. So there are some similar assumptions and similar traits with monopolistic competition compared to perfect competition, but there's one big difference, and that big difference has a pretty significant impact on what our graphs look like behind me here. Okay, so let's go through the assumptions again. This should sound pretty familiar with perfect competition. There's not, in theory, an unlimited or very large number of firms, but there are lots of different examples of firms that operate in monopolistic competition. And again, those firms are small in size. They don't have a very significant impact on the market as a whole. They might be able to do so for a little bit. There might be a few dominant firms even sprinkled in, depending on which market we're thinking about here, but for the most part, we're talking about firms that operate on a small scale. Okay? Keeping with perfect competition, there are still no barriers here, or those barriers are very small. Probably not as easy of a market to get into as perfect competition, but practically speaking, it's quite easy still to break into this market. There might be a few small barriers, like some licenses that are reasonably easy to get, but for the most part, it's a fairly easy market to both enter and exit. And for that reason, abnormal profits, those are only possible in the short run here. They are not possible in the long run. Again, the reason for that is there are no barriers. Once businesses in monopolistic competition start to make abnormal profits, other businesses will see that going on and they will want a piece of the action. They will join the market because there are no barriers to doing so. And when that happens, there's less profit to go around for a greater number of businesses. Okay? But the real significant difference here that we need to address is differentiated products. In this type of market, businesses try to distinguish themselves from other businesses. So you will often see a lot of advertising in monopolistic competition because firms sell different products, right? You're probably not going to see that much advertising in perfect competition because there's really no differences between the things that are getting sold there. So you'll see a lot of advertising here, and firms will really try to distinguish themselves, and they will try to establish some brand loyalty with their products. They're not always successful in doing so, and you'll see a lot of sort of copycat business going on here. A business will come across a really great idea, they will sell that thing, and then you'll see other businesses try to do that exact same idea, right? So a good fit for a type of market here is fast food, right? There are a number of different types of businesses that are in this market, but we might have a few dominant firms sprinkled in, like a McDonald's or a Burger King, right? But even so, if we're thinking about all the revenue that's possible that's out there in fast food, they don't have that much market share. It is a fairly easy business to get into. You'll see a range in the size of firms. You'll have sort of locally owned smaller operations, but you'll also see some chains as well. Restaurants is another good example, right? If you open a new restaurant, what usually happens is that business is really busy for the first few months. but then, maybe over the course of a year, 2 years, that business will become less and less popular, and then maybe, who knows, in 5 years or so, it might even be gone, right? So there's a lot of turnover, there's a lot of change. This is a very dynamic market structure because of this, okay? So let's get into the graphing then with those assumptions in mind, okay? There's 3 possible outcomes here. There's abnormal profits. Again, this is only possible in the short run because of the issue of no barriers. Once businesses see that abnormal profit is possible, they will join the market, and we'll have this outcome in the long run. We'll get to this in a second, though. So we have abnormal profits possible in the short run. Less likely we can have losses in the short run. But again, not in the long run, with the same reasoning with there being no abnormal profits in the long run. This does happen in monopolistic competition. Doesn't happen for very long, though. If a business is not making money in perfect competition, it's probably because their product just isn't very good. They are not able to distinguish their product from a similar product, and they're just not very competitive in that way. Okay? So what you might notice on these graphs is that the cost curves haven't moved, and that's actually a good way to think about this market structure. Businesses in this market structure typically have pretty similar costs because they're all, they're pretty similar in that way. So a good way to think about it is that the cost curves don't really move. What does move is the demand curve, and probably more significantly, the PED of the demand curve moves, right? And that's really what is going to determine profit here in a second, right? So demand will move around. It'll increase or decrease, and it also can become more inelastic if a firm is successful at distinguishing their product from others, okay? So the cost curves don't move. You'll notice that we have a normal-looking demand curve. It's downward sloping compared to the perfectly elastic demand curve in our perfect competition model, right? We have a demand curve, same thing as average revenue, and when you draw your marginal revenue curve, a good way to think about it is it just kind of has twice the slope of the demand curve. All right, so we know that when we have marginal cost equal to marginal revenue, that is the profit maximizing point, okay? And that is this point here, okay? We're going to call that Q1. So when we connect that up to the demand curve, then we'll get our price, okay? And we can know that this business is making abnormal profits when their price per unit is greater than their cost per unit. So we figure out cost where we find where Q1 hits the average cost curve, and that gives us our cost per unit. And then this whole thing here that we just drew, this is all the goal of why businesses get into business is to make abnormal profits, okay? So there is some market failure here, right? On a graph, market failure happens when marginal cost is not equal to marginal benefit. So here, we are not at producing where marginal cost equals marginal benefit. Marginal benefit, again, is the demand curve. So this is the point where there would be no market failure, and we're producing at a point that's less than that. So this point here, this would be being allocatively efficient, but this business is not producing there. Why are they not producing there? Well, they would only have normal profit if they did that, right? So businesses are profit-seeking. That's one of the reasons why market failure can happen, okay? So this is abnormal profit. This is what they're going for. Businesses will try to make as many new products as they can and hopefully stay in a series of these conditions over the long term. Eventually they'll have their profits eroded by new competitors, but as long as they're coming up with new stuff constantly, it should be okay. If a business is not able to distinguish their products from other products, then we're going to have this situation here where they make a loss. And what will probably happen to this business is they will just go the way of the dinosaurs, and they will either leave the industry, or they'll eventually realize they need to come up with some new products and they need to innovate. But let's just talk through the graph here. So again, same process, marginal cost equals marginal revenue. That point is here. Okay, connect that up to the demand curve, we get our price. Okay, and since this is a losses graph, a good way to know if you're doing that right is that the cost per unit is going to be greater than the price per unit. So again, we find costs where quantity hits the average cost curve, right? So we're going to continue that up, draw that over, that's the cost per unit. And again, we're going to shade all of this in. This business is losing a bunch of money here. Not good. That can't continue forever. One of two things will happen. They will just up and leave the market, or they will innovate and they'll come up with something new. Okay? So neither of these conditions are permanent unless some innovation happens, and then it's sort of like a reset button. So in the long run, this is the outcome that will happen. Okay, we will have normal profit, as in other words, we'll have price is equal to cost. So in order to draw it that way, the demand curve kind of needs to hit the average cost curve. So we're going to draw that maybe sort of like this. Okay, there's our demand curve. It's equal to average revenue. Okay, so really, to show normal profit, we need to be producing about here. So we need to adjust that marginal revenue curve accordingly. Our quantity is going to be about here. So we need to show that marginal revenue crosses about here with the marginal cost curve. So about there's fine. Marginal revenue. Okay, there's our profit maximizing point at Q1. We connect that up to the demand curve to get our price, and coincidentally, that is also where this quantity point hits the average cost curve. Okay, here we actually, there is no market failure. Actually, yes, sorry, there is market failure here still. These businesses produce at the profit maximizing point. They do not produce at the allocatively efficient point. Those are two different things. So same deal here. Marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit. Here, this is where they are allocatively efficient, right? So businesses that seek a profit, they usually underproduce, right? And that's the market failure, right? So I would say that this is not a significant form of market failure. The government typically doesn't really feel the need to intervene in markets like this that much. The scale of the market failure and the severity of the market failure just isn't significant enough for the government to worry about. So it is a low level of market failure. There's some degree of market power because of differentiated products here, right? They have differentiated products, so they do have the ability to set their prices, but that's not a permanent condition, right? Because of this no barriers issue, right? If they are able to make a differentiated, distinguished product, quite quickly another competitor will come along and sort of copy their stuff or make something better, and it's a whole different game, right? So some degree of market power, some degree of market failure, but neither of those things are really significant enough, right? If we're thinking about things that were markets where there is significant market power to the point that that leads to an extent of market failure that the government needs to worry about, that's mostly going to happen in our next two market structures, which is oligopoly and monopoly. Okay, so monopolistic competition is in the name, right? It is somewhere between perfect competition and monopoly. Okay? Thanks, guys.